a lot of these programs are still in use today, integrations tended to be a very manual process. So maybe it's manual in the sense that that it's an import-export interface. Or maybe it's manual in that the interface itself would have to be completely configured from the ground up. Either way, it takes a lot of effort to create and maintain those interfaces, not to mention the ongoing usage of them, especially in the realm of import-export. In today's day and age, it practically doesn't even count as an interface. Almost all systems offer some form of import-export, so it's, in our eyes, in many ways, the baseline, the minimum that should be expected. But we're looking at, with Nexonia and Intact, a real direct interface. So we're going to see the comparison between the two. Some of the weaknesses that come, especially from import-export interfaces, is that there's just too much room for mistakes to be made. When you're bringing something down to Excel, in almost all cases, you have to now manipulate that content somehow. Column orders can be off. A row could be lost. A certain cell could lose its value entirely. If there are formulas, any one of the parts of that could be broken. And if these kinds of things, if anyone here is familiar with Excel, these scenarios can happen without even realizing it. That's how easy it is. A random keystroke by accident has you hit the tab key, and all of a sudden, your import is now going to be broken. Not to mention the possibility that there is extra effort required just to make sure that there aren't duplication of transactions in the system. So when you have to rely on import-export or even a completely manual interface that the two systems do in some way communicate, you have to always figure out how to identify which ones have been transitioned and moved from one system to the next. And without having that capability, or hypothetically not putting in the time to make sure that it's kept up to date, it's very easy for the same transactions to be transitioned from one system to the next numerous times. And what's worse is, depending on the exact configuration of the system, it's easy to not even realize that those are duplicates. If there's any form of auto-numbering that takes place, for instance, the unique identifier from the source point might not be there any longer. And all of a sudden, it looks like you legitimately have two entries, and the only way to identify that you do in fact have a duplicate is to do a reconciliation. And as I'm sure everyone here can appreciate, once you've had to do that once, it's becoming part of your normal process because you can't leave that open anymore, right? And finally, there tends not to be any validation behind the content. So how do you know that what was brought into your financial management system was actually identical to the starting point? So using Nexonia as an example, if we downloaded an expense report, if we were looking at a manual interface, how would I, in finance, be confident that that entry that I'm importing into my Intacct system is identical to the entry that was exported from Nexonia? So when you have these manual processes, you're leaving a lot of room for things to go wrong before, during, and after the process. And then it just takes more time than ever before to now have to go rectify that situation. So when we think about modern interfaces and what they could do, the primary thing that I always think is most important is just the ease of use. No one has to worry about manipulating or dealing with files, because in a modern interface, the systems communicate directly with each other. They use what's called APIs, an application programming interface. And it basically is a standardized set of communication tools that different programs can utilize in order to know exactly what to say to each other and what information to send. So this is the foundation for how these programs actually talk to each other directly, instead of relying on you to specify any details, or even, worst case, do an import-export. That direct communication is the foundation for having guaranteed accuracy in the content, because the actual details, let's say an expense report is being brought into your accounting system, the actual details are never being touched. The starting point is simply saying, hey MIP, hey Intacct, you need to take this field and put whatever is in it into this matching field on your end. And then the interfaces just carry everything over back and forth, and the detail is brought over exactly as it started. That security that comes from the content matching the starting point means that you don't ever have to be double checking anything to go find out if something is different. And then the best part is the instant transmission, the fact that it takes moments for any new information to be brought from one point to the other. Because these modern interfaces are relying on web connections for the starting and ending points to communicate with each other, they're only limited by bandwidth, which for any limited amount of data that we would have in our system is effectively instant. And this is a huge change. So we're going to look and start to see some of the ways that Nexonia and Intacct can interface with each other as an example of one of these new modern interfaces. So what parts of the system between Nexonia and Intacct communicate with each other? So the sync is actually bidirectional. And if we start from the point of Intacct, since that's the foundation for all of our financial management, with Nexonia being an extension of its capabilities, when we start with Intacct, we know that our chart of account is housed there. We have our funds, our grants or our contracts or programs, whatever it might be. In Nexonia, you can replicate your entire chart, and better, the entire chart will then sync with Intacct. So imagine that you have a new program, and you're using Nexonia and Intacct, and in Intacct, you've recorded that new program code. Well, that new program code is then going to sync up with Nexonia and become available there as well. And that process takes about 30 seconds, give or take. And so what that means is that the staff that are using Nexonia, or any third-party program for that matter, are confident that they have access to the most up-to-date chart. And so that they can then rely on what they have available to select when they're doing their entries and know that the content available to them is accurate. And I have a sub-point here about the allocations. Intacct utilizes direct allocations as its primary form, and those allocations tables can be brought over from Intacct into Nexonia as well, available on both the purchasing and payables applications. So what that means is that Nexonia now can allow staff members to record a purchasing document in Nexonia and have an allocation code applied at the line level, similar to MIP's distribution codes, and then that document can eventually make its way into Intacct's accounts payable with the allocation value. So rather than having to manually code everything out line for line, instead the staff can rely on the pre-configured allocations that the finance team has created, and then they know that they're having the appropriate distribution based on the selected code. No guessing on the part of the staff. So now we're in Nexonia. Our team is using it. Our chart of accounts is there. Our allocations table is available. So what about the parts of Nexonia? Where can those go? So expense reports out of Nexonia actually have 3 different landing points that they can go to. The first is employee expenses directly out of the time and expenses application. The second is directly into accounts payable with your employees listed as a vendor. And finally, has a journal entry directly. Additionally, credit card transactions can also go into accounts payable or a journal entry, or the recommended route is using the cash management module so that we can utilize the reconciliation tools that are available. Purchasing documents can go into the purchasing application in Intacct. That's a direct one-to-one. And it looks like this PowerPoint actually has an incorrect note. The AP and PO should be switched. So purchasing can go to either the purchasing application or AP, and the AP in Nexonia can go directly to the AP in Intacct. And finally, our timesheets go to our timesheets directly. So that's a high level. But what does this really mean for staff that are using it? Well, let's go into the system and find out. Oh, okay. Timeout during sign-in. So here we're logged into the Nexonia system. I'm a user. I go around. I record timesheets and expenses. I have credit card charges. I put in purchase requests for the programs that I'm working on. I use the entirety of the system, basically. And so I, as an end user, don't even realize it. I rely every day on that interface taking place in real time. That when finance records a new program code that I'm working on, but the first time I go into Nexonia, I know that that program code is available. And so when I go and I record an expense report, go and add new, I'm adding an expense item. I know that my grant code and my donor and other are operating on defined lists managed solely by the finance team coming out of Intacct. So I don't have to worry about, oh, that donor or other, that funding source value, and you sync it over. That request wouldn't be necessary because it'll do that automatically. And it's an example of the modern syncing. And again, it doesn't just apply to our donor and other. It applies to all of our dimensions, where we could pick our grants, and we could pick our category field and our department list, and so on. And just because a dimension or a segment isn't visible on one of these entry screens does not mean that it's not in use. It just means that it's hidden away. So even when the staff aren't seeing every dimension, you can still utilize the sync to maintain the dimension table in Nexonia after having first managed it in Intacct. The idea being that even though these are two independent systems, the connection that's formed between them means that you only have to manage the chart on one side, and the other will inherently mirror it. And as I go through and populate this entry, when I have it completed, and the same thing applies to the charge card transactions, I now have my document ready for approval and submission, and my manager carries over from Intacct, and it goes through all the desired approval workflows, and then it's available to be exported. And then again, based on your organization's unique process, that export can land this expense report has either an employee expense record in Intacct, has an accounts payable document, again with the employee as the vendor, or has a journal entry directly. And in all cases, all of your dimension values, whatever originated from Nexonia, will fill in and populate the appropriate fields in Intacct. Now, in this scenario, what if this expense report had both credit card charges and out-of-pocket, like this expense report right here? Well, the interface is smart enough to know that out-of-pocket expenses, those that are reimbursable to the staff member directly, need to go to one part of Intacct, whereas the credit card interface has to go to another. And the final landing point for all of that is entirely up to your preferences within the bounds of the options available. But however it ends up being configured, once that's done, it takes no more additional thought. Nexonia in this scenario is configured to send the out-of-pocket expenses to the standard employee expenses form, and the credit card charges go through the cash management tool. And so even though these are on a single expense report in Nexonia, managed collectively, approved collectively, at the point of syncing, Nexonia reads these 5 lines and determines where each line should go. And so the sync would send these 3 lines, denoted over here as part of a credit card charge. It will know to put those into cash management, and then send these other 2 lines, has the remaining, into an employee expense report. And this is all automatic, ongoing. So the configuration takes place at the start to make sure it's going to work the way you want it to. And once that's done, you never have to think about it again. Timesheets go to Timesheets So that's rather straightforward. But if we look at the timesheets themselves, it's important to note that the synchronization process isn't just limited to dimension values. Any fields can be mapped together. So for instance, if your timesheets had a custom field on them, that could be recreated in Nexonia and then could be populated first in Nexonia and then sync the value over into Intacct. So again, this sync is not just limited to core content in the system. You can go out to any part of the entries that you want and apply a mapping in order to make sure that right down to the field, those particular entries are syncing properly. And so as I open this timesheet, we see that there's two lines here, starting on the 4th of April, 2016, and going through Friday the 8th. And so as these entries are here, each one is assigned a specific fund, a task category, a grant code. And when that timesheet would get synced over into Intacct, all of that detail will carry over with it. And for those then that have the project accounting application, those timesheets posting to Intacct will generate the corresponding statistical journal entries, which would then allow you to use the time entries that originated from Nexonia all the way on the other end of the spectrum. You'll be able to use them for computational and statistical analysis in Intacct. And again, all of that includes custom fields. So if this default screen just isn't enough for you and you need your staff to provide even more information, that can be accommodated. All in all, though, timesheets are very, very straightforward. Not a whole lot of fluff to them. Time off, for those that may not be aware, is a time off management tool that Nexonia offers, and it interfaces with the Timesheets application in order to automatically fill and lock time off requests into a specified settings so that they can't be miscoded. And the allocations is a replacement for the timesheets for those organizations that need to utilize certification of effort instead of full-fledged timesheet detail. Now you get to the real meat of it. So we have these purchasing applications here. So as I mentioned before, purchasing can go directly into the purchasing application or accounts payable in Intacct. And so just like the timesheets and just like the expense reports, all of the fields that are available in Intacct can be replicated in Nexonia, including the ability for custom field usage. Additionally, fields can be left in Nexonia, for instance, or vice versa in Intacct, and not be utilized in the other system. And in those scenarios, that information is simply ignored from the interface, as opposed to generating an error. This is really nice because it allows you to keep your interface however detailed or summarized as you want, regardless of how you have Nexonia itself configured. Also note here on the purchase order screen that our line has this allocation value. So this is an example where a non-chart of accounts value is still being synced into Nexonia. And so if your staff use the same consistent allocations time and time again, and you want to be able to allow them to do that in Nexonia, not only do you have that capability, but the field itself can sync with your Intacct list. So just like your list of vendors, for instance, you only have to maintain this allocations table in Intacct. And then Nexonia keeps itself up to date accordingly. And so we have this purchase order 12. And let's go look at what takes place on the end of the workflow in the payables application, where I open up document 15. And here we see all of our line level details again, including our allocation code and our linkage to the source purchase order. And you'll see here this little exported icon. So Nexonia is indicating that this particular accounts payable document was fully exported into Intacct. So this makes it very easy from a visual standpoint to identify what activity has and hasn't synchronized over yet. And this entry could be drafted. My department is blank. I started it when a new department code hadn't been created, and the next day I was notified that it's been done. Now I can come back in and, oh, look at that, Central Facilities has been created now. And they didn't end up creating that in Nexonia, they just made it in Intacct, and then Nexonia updates itself. And again, that applies to all dimensions, all fields that get mapped from Intacct into Nexonia. And from here, this bill, regardless of the fact that it originated from a purchasing document, this bill now can go into Intacct, has either a standard AP bill or has a journal entry. And Intacct is smart enough to tell us when certain things came from Nexonia. So I have here a filter to show us the bills that came from Nexonia, and here's our next 1015 relating to our 1015 bill in Nexonia directly. And if I open this up and we look at the content in Intacct, we'll see that all of the details are the same. The description, new purchase, the account, which is driven by the category, a plain text replacement so that staff can search based on the actual names and what they really need and not the hard-coded account number. And the rest of our dimension values are blank because our allocation populates them. And so this entry, fully allocated expense, originated from Nexonia, having had a full approval workflow containing the allocation as part of the initial requisition. And these interfaces aren't an all or nothing approach. We can configure these interfaces so that they're conditional based on certain factors. So for instance, imagine that we weren't using the time and expenses application, and we wanted our out-of-pocket expenses to go to accounts payable and associate the employee as a vendor. Well, settings on the expense reports themselves on the lines can tell Nexonia, if I close this, go back to my expenses, the interface can be configured such that when the paid by is employee, instead of sending that line into employee expenses, it instead will send it into accounts payable. Again, same information available, and it will apply the employee as the vendor record itself. None of this requires any manual intervention. So we would have essentially a discovery. How would you like to interface the function? And then we would make that happen. And then it just goes on smooth as butter. So that's the expenses where they're coming in the AP side. But what about credit card charges? Well, the default, the recommended process is to go through the charge card transactions functionality. This is the foundation for how you can get vendor-specific activity and utilize the credit card reconciliation tool. And so we would have this charge card transactions list with a number of different credit card charges listed out. And the synchronization between the two systems isn't just an instant setup. It also allows it to be scheduled. Our most common configuration is doing it every night. That way it's consistent and people can expect the next day you will have whatever you need. And that's in addition to being able to manually force a sync whenever. So imagine, I put in a request with my finance team. I've started a new program, and I need the code in, and I'm trying to do my entries. Well, the finance team can respond right away and make the code and force the sync immediately, and then in a moment I have the new code ready to go and available. 10 years ago, that would have required an import-export, or if it's just a single value, manually going into the second system to recreate it. And we call that duplication of effort. We don't like that. So as you can see, the sync between Nexonia and Intacct is extremely strong. It is an example of the types of modern technology that we promote heavily today, and every organization, no matter what, can benefit from these types of tools. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions that anybody has. So I see one. Can AP and Nexonia be used to enter invoice approval to pay vendors? So no, Nexonia is purely a platform for recording the initial expense and approving the expense. Everything around processing of payments would take place in your Intacct or MIP system, and then you would be able to then notify Nexonia that so-and-so documents were paid. So after the payments were done and those transactions were flagged as having been paid, Nexonia would be accurate for determining that list. But again, it can't do anything around processing payments themselves. And the next question was, does Nexonia Timesheets integrate with payroll services like Paychecks and ADP? And that is a great question. We have never had that request before. In the past, it's usually ADP or Paychecks, being the tool that the staff use already, replaces Nexonia Timesheets. So we are going to find that answer out for everyone and send that up as a follow-up. And so I am going to unmute everyone. All right, I'm going to remute everyone. Getting some reverberation here. If you could all mute your own phones, and then I will unmute you on my end, and then you'll be able to freely speak. Okay, so now everyone can feel free to openly ask questions. Simply unmute yourself, and then when you're finished speaking, remute so that we can cut any feedback out.
I'm hearing these people coming through here. I'm so confused.
I have a question about expense types. Can you limit a Nexonia user to specific expense types?
Yes. In fact, Nexonia allows you to filter pretty much everything down to the individual user level. Okay, Then for those of you that feel satisfied and have no questions, thank you all for attending. I am going to keep the line open for a while longer, so you can, anyone that wants can feel free to stay, and I will be available for questions for a while. For those that are going to leave now, thank you again, and we hope to hear from you soon.